PowerPoint, so I'm afraid it's just me. And I'll introduce myself, I guess, as to why I'm here, not being a scientist and not being involved in NRM. I was a senior campaigner for the Wilderness Society for 9 years, including 5 years as South Australian campaign manager in the early 2000s. Since then, I've been in a senior policy and campaign position in the welfare sector in a welfare non-government organisation. And prior to all that, 15 years in student politics and a range of community organisations. So I guess for about 30 years, I've been a community and a professional campaigner. And I guess I'm here because when one of the conference organisers told me that the topic was about getting science input into policy, I just sort of laughed and said, don't ask a scientist. You'll just get laments about irrational politics or a call for better science communication. I'm sorry, I'm not sure Galileo would have fared any better if he had have communicated his message to the church with any more skill. I think there was other issues at play. The fact is that policy and government's never been about science and facts, and it won't be anytime soon. So if you want science to have a role, you've got to get over the notion that people will be convinced by facts, and if not, they're somehow stupid. Again, the abstract from the talk today says, policy will always be informed by a range of inputs: history, culture, ideology, moral values, socio-economic theory, or plain self-interest. But actually, just more bluntly, ultimately, it's about power. And in a sense, it's about power to make decisions and to impact upon decision-making processes. So where does science fit into that? Well, when I started with the Wilderness Society, my academic background was economics and politics, and I said to the friend of mine who was the former national director, look, I really want this job, but I'm not sure, I don't really know anything about the environment. And he said, don't worry, look, the scientists can give you the information and the brief. Your job is to get your head around the brief and deliver a campaign to get the outcomes we want. And I think that's a crucial starting point, that science does provide that brief. But really, once you've got that as a campaigner, so my experience is once I've got that brief and I know what I'm doing, it's like, then I look at, okay, what are the tools I've got to develop a strategy? And if it's about, and I'll just run you through a few, if it's about getting an issue on an agenda, I can use personal connections, I can organise street theatre or some media stunt, I can take out paid advertisements. If I'm in an organisation with enough status, I can do a media statement. If I'm trying to build a campaign, I can do things like petitions or rallies, public meetings. I can look for formal alliances with other interested groups. I might commission research reports. I might ask scientists to make a statement, but I might also look for celebrity endorsements from people who have absolutely no background in it but look nice on TV. If I'm looking for political leverage, I can directly lobby politicians. I can look for questions in Parliament. And, the question a minute ago about the evaluation of the no species loss, to me, that's a question to the minister, not to the department and people who are struggling with budgets. You ask the minister, where's the evaluation of that program? Anyway, what else would I do for political leverage? I can look for parliamentary inquiries, marginal seats campaigns, freedom of information applications always focus people's minds. Or I can be trying to sell a policy to anybody in Parliament and look for a champion in Parliament. And if all that fails as a last resort, there's always direct action or potential legal challenges. And I guess not all of those are going to be appropriate in every circumstance, but I guess one of the obvious things from that is that very few of those tools that I've got as a campaigner require scientific input or policy detail. It's actually a different animal. It's about getting the power and influence in the policy decision-making. And in that game, science and facts are only one tool among many. I'll talk just briefly about the campaign that I led that was around the protection and establishment of the Wilderness Protection Area in Yellabinna, a large section of Mallee on the west coast, north of Ceduna. There was a whole range of good scientific reasons why that should have been protected. It was at the border and the margin for a range of species, had a good north-south connection for species migration with climate change. There were endangered species there, and it was part of a landscape-wide vision around having core, strictly protected areas and then buffer zones and landscape management planning. So it was a core to a much bigger picture. So there were good scientific bases. I walked around with Peter Copley and Tony Robinson's biodiversity survey under my arm for about 3 years. But the headline ask and all the campaign didn't follow that. The headline ask, we wanted 1 million hectares in a wilderness protection area. Why? Well, because 1 million hectares sounds good. We knew the science said bigger is better, but you know, the number was about PR. And frankly, we spent most of the campaign just trying to get it on the radar because it's a long way away and it wasn't that sexy a campaign. But in that campaign, just trying to get it on the radar, what we wanted from scientists wasn't top-level science and it wasn't debates about appropriate reserve design. It was actually cute stories that I could tell the public about plants and animals and the place. And meanwhile, while we were developing that sort of public awareness, in the meantime, the mining department was talking to industry and encouraging them to get exploration licences before the greenies could lock up the land. And the end game then wasn't scientific reserve planning, it was a government balancing mining interests and trying to keep us happy. In the end, we got about half of what we asked for, but it was at the time the biggest strictly protected area proclaimed for about 30 years. And I look back on that and think, well, would we have got more area protected if we had have had better science? I doubt it. Would we have got more area protected if we'd had it run a bigger campaign and a better resourced campaign? Yeah, probably, maybe. Look, I'll give you one more quick example I want to point to, just to try and convince you that politics isn't actually a dirty word. And it's a conservation park quite near Adelaide, surrounded by some good bush that was under threat from a range of development proposals. Frankly, it was a bit of a no-brainer to extend the conservation park. The local community groups in the area had raised the issue about wanting this conservation park extended. My understanding was the department had gone through its formal policy processes and put up a recommendation for the extension of this park, and it didn't happen. And then along came a by-election. By-elections are campaigners' heaven. One of the candidates took it up as an issue and used it as a preference negotiation. And again, it wasn't particularly about science, I know, because I did the preference negotiation. I remember standing on street corners and knowing that there were people in the groups that I was working with that knew far more about the area than I did, but it was my job to deliver the negotiation. The end result was we had the government, we had a position of power that we had something the government wanted. In the end, we got the extension of the conservation park, they got their preferences, that member is now a member of parliament, and the government was happy. So I guess from that I'm drawing that, you know, politics doesn't have to be an irrational interference in a policy process. It can actually be a tool and a way of achieving gains beyond what we can achieve through the formal policy processes. And so I think about the role of science in those sort of policy processes and the role of science in politics. And as I said, for me, fundamentally and first off, it's about setting the agenda, telling us what we need, what needs to be done and why, and then potentially providing some ammunition for campaigners. But when you move from that scientific space about what needs to be done into the policy and campaign space, I think, sorry, I've just lost my place. When you move into the campaign space, you need to think like a campaigner about power in the decision-making processes, not like a scientist about what the facts are and what the facts tell you. It's thinking about how do we exercise and how do we win. It's about chess, really. And I guess in saying that, there are oftentimes crucial strategic points where the scientific voice is absolutely crucial. Climate change has obviously been one of them over the last many years, and hats off to the scientists who have driven that awareness raising. But yeah, fundamentally, agenda setting and then start thinking like a campaigner. What's the role of the non-government organisations? I think it simply can't be just to articulate science or to generate and frankly waste your time on detailed policy documents as if you're the government. And surely the role of an NGO isn't just to provide cheap labour for tree planting and weeding. I think the best role for non-government organisations is actually to campaign, to get politically dirty, because we have the freedom, we can mobilise resources, and we have the freedoms that other people who actually know in government that actually might know what the problems are, we have the freedoms that they don't. And if non-government organisations don't engage in policy and campaigning, then who will, on behalf of nature? And finally, the role of government scientists and government policy people seems to me, firstly, obviously, do your job, do good science, good policy, but don't think that that's enough. I think there needs to be work with and alongside environment NGOs, and I don't mean the sort of formal consultation that happens where actually the real decision-making is somewhere else. I mean actually working with people, exchanging information, decisions, intelligence about players and strategies. And then think about how NGOs can help you achieve your internal policy goals and ends that you want. There are a couple in my sector, in my current job, I know there are a couple of welfare services operating because they were funded from the budget, because the department worked with us and said, okay, we're looking at putting this submission up for funding this service, what do you reckon? We said, great. And the ability for us to articulate publicly this need and that we support this actually buttressed the position of the department going to Treasury to get money. And I think I'll leave it there.
Excellent, thank you, Greg. Has anyone got any questions on that thought-provoking speech? Anyone? Oh, there's a question up there, up the back there. We always make our microphone people run, don't we? We'll be very fit at the end of the of this conference.
Terrific talk, thank you. Even with the NGOs, a lot of our funding comes from government sources as well. Do you have any hints for how to negotiate that tension between your funder and a positive critique of something that funder might be doing?
Yeah, well spotted. Look, in my job in the Wilderness Society, we were at the forefront of attacks by government. That was on tax deductibility, not funding, but it was all about government trying to rein in the ability of non-government organisations to advocate. There's no simple answer, there's no easy answer. Some of the stuff we did then was about was regulatory regime change to create the Australian Charities Not-for-Profit Commission to provide a buffer to ministers, anti-gag legislation that we've now got mirrored at the state level. So there's some of that regulation change that we've been working on over a number of years. At the one-on-one level, it's actually just hard, but frankly, I think I've probably seen as many instances of NGOs in my sector now and in the environment movement silencing themselves for fear of what a government might do. I suspect governments are a bit more robust than we give them credit for, and a bit more able to take some criticism than we give them credit for. And I know that from some of the things I've said about ministers, and yet they still took meetings with me and we'd still have a conversation. So I think, look, it is a real problem. It's a structural problem. There's no easy way around it, but I think we can afford to be more robust than we often are.
Excellent, thank you. I think we're at time for the next one, so I think we'll all take something away from that and give us something to think about over the next little while. So thank you very much, Greg. I really enjoyed that. So next up we have Tom, who's going to